Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at 10b, graphing polynomials. Now if you remember what a polynomial is from last lesson, it's basically just a graph of a function. It just could have various degree of the function. We've worked a lot on this in year 11. If you've been in my accelerated class in particular, it was basically going to be doing the same thing. Okay, now I guess before we look at the examples that I've got in here, they're the two that we're going to have a look at graphing. This one on the left here and the one on the right. I want you to think back to what we learned when we did look at these in year 11. So we're going to have a look at graphing them without calculus. So we could use calculus, but these guys, these two functions are already in their fully factored forms. So we really are going to use that to our advantage in this case. We can have a look at the zeros on each of these. So we can quickly work out what the zeros are for each of these bracketed terms in our functions, or our polynomial, we could call it that as well. But what we also want to remember, and that's my first little note up there, is we want to remember to look at the first term, or the leading term in our polynomial. What would it be? As it's going to tell us whether that function is positive or negative. So we can quickly have a look at what our highest powered x term would have as its coefficient. If it's positive, then we know that it's, if you think back to what we learnt last year, a positive function is going to start up here in that first right hand top quadrant, in our first quadrant, and a negative function, when we're drawing it, it's going to start down the bottom here. And that's probably one of the most important things to be able to sketch these really quickly. So the steps that are down here are saying we want to find the y-intercept, we want to find the x-intercept, we want to identify the shape. So we can actually really quickly draw these. If we have a look at this graph of this first one here, if we have a look at it, there's an x, there's an x, there's an x. So there's three x's, so it's going to be a cubic. If we were to multiply those x's together, and any numbers that are in front of it, the 2 we don't need to take into account because it's a positive 2, but there's an x, a positive x times a positive x times a positive x. We're going to have a positive cubic. So our graph is going to start up here in that top quadrant. We know that, and that's the biggest tip in drawing this quickly. It's a positive cubic. Now, our zeros are going to be, we set each of these brackets to 0. The 2 doesn't come into play to work out the zeros. So we're going to have zeros at -2, 1, and -3, and I'll pop those down there. So we know that. The other important thing that we need is where it cuts the y-axis. So our zeros, remember, where it cuts the x-axis. We need to know where it cuts the y-axis, and it cuts the y-axis when x is 0. So I've just popped 0 in for each of these. So it's going to be 2 times -1 times 3. So 2 times 2 times -1 times 3 is -12. So it's going to cut the y-intercept, be having a y-intercept of -12. So that information is enough to draw that. We know it's positive, so it starts in that top quadrant. It's going to have zeros at these 3 points, and it's going to have a y-intercept at 12, and it's a cubic. So if we put all that together here, it starts up here. So it's going to start in this corner up here. It's going to cut at 1, -2, and -3, and it has a -12 y-intercept. So if we start here, we go through our first point, down to -12, it's got to cut at -2 again, it's going to have to cut at -3, so it needs to turn. That's enough to sketch this graph. It hasn't asked us to look at turning points at this point, and we would use our calculus to find that, which we won't need to do for this. Okay, the second one, looking at the graph of the next one, again, it's fully factorized. It's going to have zeros at 1 and 1. It's a double root, so it's going to bounce at the double root. We're going to have another 0 at -5 and another one at 2. So we're just setting these brackets to 0. We know it is a power of 4, or a quartic, because we've got 2 x's, an x squared, another x, and another x. But it's going to be a negative quartic. This x squared will be positive, times this x here is positive, times this x here is minus. So we're going to have a negative power for our x. So it's going to have a -1 or a minus some other coefficient out the front of the x to the power of 4 is our leading coefficient. So it's going to start in this quadrant here. And that is, again, like our previous question, one of the biggest tips that will help us to quickly draw this. So it starts down here. We know we've got our zeros. We know it's a quartic. We also need a y-intercept. A y-intercept happens when x is 0. So I've just set these to 0. -1 squared is 1. 5 plus 0 is 5. and 2 minus 0 is 2. So 1 times 5 times 2 is 10. I'm going to put all that information together in my graph. I've already drawn it. We know it starts down here because it's a negative. It's going to move up. It's going to go to 2. It has to bounce at the double root of 1, so it needs to turn around. It's not going to cut through here because it's a double root, so it's going to bounce off, hit up at 10, and go down to minus 5. This is stuff that you should know from year 11's advanced course, okay? So this is stuff that if you're finding difficult, you're not going to need to go and work through that fairly quickly. Now, that's the stuff in our notes for today, but I don't think that's enough to get us through. So again, like I normally have, in our OneNote, I'm going to pop together some solutions for our exercise under 10B. So working through our textbook, the questions that we're going to be working through are in our OneNote. These are our questions, and I'll pop some solutions up there for you to have a look at. I would prefer it if you don't rely on my solutions, that you rely on you having a go first. And if you can't do them, then I want to let you have a look at some of mine. I'm not going to put all the ones up there. I'm going to put some tricky ones up there. Have a go. 10B. Make sure you're marking your answers. If you can't do them, you need to come and see me and we will sort that out. Good luck.